Forget everything you think you know about the dark side of history. We're not talking about ghost stories or campfire tales. This is about real power, real blood, real pacts signed in the shadows of the world's most powerful institutions. An emperor who sliced his own hand to rewrite his fate. That's just the start. Three sisters who conned the world into believing they spoke with the dead, and a biblical prophet whose destiny was decided by a game of chance. This is the dark, disturbing occult iceberg, a structure of forbidden knowledge that I compiled entirely myself. We'll start with a strange religion, but we're working our way down to some of the most unsettling and sinister events in occult history, the kind of secrets man was never meant to know. And the deeper we go, the more dangerous the truth becomes. But before we begin, tell me this in the comments. What secret are you most afraid of finding out? In the 19th century, when new religions and philosophies began breaking away from the core three, a strange new movement started crawling out of the woodwork. One of them was Thelema. It was created by Aleister Crowley, a highly controversial British occultist who, as we'll see, comes up a lot as we dive deeper down this iceberg. All you need to know for now is that Crowley was heavily into drugs, erotic magic, and an utterly decadent lifestyle. While that kind of living wouldn't raise an eyebrow today, in the highly moralistic 19th century, it made people's skin crawl, even other occultists. But Crowley didn't let this notoriety come between him and his mission of starting Thelema. The story goes that Crowley was on his honeymoon in Egypt when he was visited by a supernatural being named Iwas. Iwas dictated the Book of the Law to Crowley, and that book would become the religious text for Thelema. Thelema is often represented by the number 93, and its followers often greet each other by calling out the number. Thelema is based on two core philosophies. Love is the law, love under will, and the more famous, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. There have been countless interpretations of this phrase, but followers of Thelema insist it is not an excuse to simply do whatever you like. Yet, many still argue that Crowley created Thelema primarily to justify his hedonistic and decadent lifestyle. These two paths in the occult represent radically different approaches to magic and spirituality. One is seen as the light, the other as the darkness. The very first person to coin this terminology was the 19th century occultist Madame Blavatsky during her stay in India. She encountered a mode of worship called Vamakara, which focused on performing Hindu taboos, such as eating meat, drinking alcohol, and performing rituals in graveyards. Blavatsky translated Vamachara to mean the left-hand path. So, what exactly are these two paths? Think of them as black magic and white magic. They are two opposing outlooks in the search for spiritual attainment using magic. The right-hand path is connected with all things conventional, correct, and good. Worshippers on this path follow practices that embrace societal norms and community. It's the safe, good side. The opposite, of course, is the left-hand path. This is the one that strikes fear in the hearts of many. It is the darker side of magic, where practitioners embrace all things unconventional, taboo, and even anarchy during rituals. On the extreme ends of the left-hand path, practitioners could perform rituals that involve things like eating feces, corpses, and even having orgies. As you can see, this is not for the faint-hearted. Mediumship, speaking to the dead. Mediumship, a way to reach out to the dead by channeling a spirit. Was it an elaborate hoax that swept through the world, or perhaps something real? It became massively popular in the late 19th century when mediums conducted seances at special parties and gatherings, even for big Hollywood celebrities. They would get the spirits to identify themselves using seance tables or Ouija boards. Turning out the lights and knocking on tables, walls, and doors was another common way a spirit would make itself known. Before long, everyone was calling a medium. Two of the most prominent figures who turned to mediumship were Queen Victoria and the First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln. After her third son died of typhoid fever, Mary was inconsolable and began to dabble in spiritualism, meeting with mediums who held seances to help her contact her lost child. Queen Victoria, meanwhile, kept a live-in medium at the palace who channeled her late husband, Prince Albert, for 30 years. One of the most successful acts of the 19th century was the three Fox sisters. They rose to stardom after claiming there was a spirit communicating with them in their home by knocking on the walls. For 40 years, the three sisters ruled the mediumship roost, demonstrating their purported powers to crowds across the country. And then, the bubble burst. One of the sisters took a $1,500 check in exchange for her confession. It had all been a hoax. They had made it all up. But the spiritualism train was unstoppable, and today there is very little mention of that part of the story, almost as if it never happened. Today, consulting a medium can cost a pretty penny. Some channel spirits, while others rely on tarot cards or crystal balls. They don't just channel dead family members anymore. Some mediums have worked with law enforcement to help find missing people, bodies, and even prime suspects. Divination is the art of predicting the future. While there are many ways to do this, only one involves the use of a body part best used for picking up a coffee mug: your hand. Palm reading is simply finding out a person's fate using their palms. It was first practiced in India, where it was believed that every part of your hand, from its shape to its lines, predicts important moments in your life. It might sound fanatical, but the first emperor of France, Napoleon Bonaparte, was an avid believer in this form. The story goes that at one palm reading, a palmist noticed Napoleon's fate line was missing. He predicted that the emperor would suffer misfortune, failures, and ill fate. So, what did Napoleon do? He immediately got out his sword and sliced his palm to create his own fate line. Today, Napoleon is considered one of the greatest military commanders in history. Now, we're not saying everyone should go around slicing their palms, but it did work out for him. However, if slicing your palm sounds a little too intense to tweak your future, drawing lots just might be up your alley. While this method of divination isn't as common anymore, it was the bee's knees in historic times. Ancient gods were consulted using tiny tablets made of wood that were thrown like dice. Based on the order the lots fell, the diviners would then give answers. The last place you'd expect to find a story backing up this practice is the Christian Bible. But, voila. The book of Jonah tells the story of the prophet Jonah, who was swallowed by a whale. God had told Jonah to go to a certain town, but he rebelled and hopped on a ship. That's when a crazy storm hit, and everyone on board started pointing fingers, convinced that the storm was sent by God to punish someone. They decided to draw lots. Jonah picked the short stick, and the poor guy was immediately thrown off the ship. Here's the kicker. Once he got in the water, the storm immediately stopped. So, did the lots get it right? If you're the kind of person who spends time on Google Maps, you might notice that some houses are blurred out. One of them is on 108 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, New York. It has had its address changed a couple of times, but sightseers continue to lurk outside it every day. That's because this unassuming house was the scene of not one mystery, but two. It all began on the 13th of November 1974. Patrons at a local bar in Amityville were relaxing when 3-year-old Ronald DeFeo burst in, screaming, "You've got to help me." Ronald's entire family of 6 lay face down in their beds, killed by gunshot. It was like some supernatural force had kept the weapons quiet, so none of them woke until it was too late. With a killer on the rampage, Ronald was put in protective custody. But then, plot twist, Ronald turned out to be the killer. He told them some voices in the house had made him kill his family. Ronald was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Yet, while Ronald was beginning his life behind bars, George and Kathleen Lutz were scoring the deal of a lifetime. They had bought the fully furnished murder house at a steal, can't imagine why, and moved in with their 3 children. But only 3 weeks later, they would be running out of the house, screaming that it was haunted. It had started with strange odors, and gelatinous substances started coming out of the carpet and keyholes. Then, the front door started slamming shut in the middle of the night. One time, George saw Kathleen levitate, while her face transformed into that of an old woman with scratches all over her body, and then, the kids' beds started to float too. All of this paranormal activity started at 3:15 a.m., the exact time Ronald had started killing his family. Had Ronald really been compelled to kill his family by the occult? And were the same demons sticking around to bring the same end to the Lutz family? I guess we'll never know. The Golden Dawn Order was one of the most popular secret societies to emerge in the 19th century. Many of its members were the crème de la crème of society. Yet, just a few years later, it would be no more. The Golden Dawn Order was started in London in 1887 by three Freemasons: William Westcott, William Woodman, and Samuel Mathers. They founded it after decoding a magic handbook called the Cipher Manuscripts. Unlike other secret orders of the time, the Golden Dawn opened its doors to both men and women. In less than a decade, the Golden Dawn grew to hundreds of members, attracting people from all walks of life, including the notable actress Florence Farr, Nobel Prize winner and poet William Butler Yeats, and, yes, the notorious English author Aleister Crowley. But, as you can probably guess, Crowley's presence in the order didn't exactly go down well. The other occultists didn't like him, not just because of his depraved lifestyle, but because he started feuds with other members. So, when he tried to move to a higher level in the order, they voted against him. But Crowley was friends with the last standing Golden Dawn founder, Samuel Mathers. Mathers went against the wishes of the order and initiated Crowley anyway. Like that wasn't bad enough, the two teamed up to take over one of the temples belonging to the order. Crowley also stole their secrets and published them in his magazine. Even though Mathers and Crowley were cut off from the order, the damage was done. Several followers left to start their own groups. Mathers tried to rally the remaining few, but the Golden Dawn was never able to reach its earlier level of prominence again. The name Aleister Crowley has come up a few times in this iceberg already. The founder of Thelema, a member of the Golden Dawn, and more. But before Crowley started his religion and destroyed another, he was just the son of Edward Crowley. Edward was so wealthy that he would retire even before his son was born. A devout Christian, Edward would read a chapter from the Bible to his wife and son every day before dinner time. You could pretty much say that their family was perfectly happy. However, disaster struck when Crowley was 11. His father died of cancer. Crowley became a Christian skeptic, and once he came into his inheritance, he struck out on his own. Crowley lived extravagantly and went on crazy adventures. His private life was just as extreme. He was hooked on heroin and lived openly as a bisexual. Later on, Crowley developed an interest in the occult. He joined several orders, including the Golden Dawn, eventually starting his own, Thelema. When his inheritance started running low, he moved to Sicily with his followers and opened a commune there. His drug use only got more out of control. The bubble finally burst when a follower, Raoul Loveday, died at the commune. Loveday's wife returned to Britain and spilled all the secrets about life in the commune. She claimed Crowley made her husband drink the blood of a sacrificed cat, forced them to cut themselves, and even allowed children to watch while he performed magic. The press went wild, and Crowley was tagged the wickedest man alive. News reached the Sicilian government, and Crowley was deported. He would move to France but was also deported. Crowley had no choice but to return to London, bankrupt and sick. He tried suing the newspapers for libel, but he never got paid in the end. Aleister Crowley died penniless in a boarding house. It's Halloween of 1985. But trick-or-treating is the farthest thing from the minds of the people gathered in the park. They had all come to see a fire destroy 2,500 copies of a painting featuring a similar theme. Children crying. The portraits had once hung across homes in the UK, but now people couldn't get rid of them fast enough. It would take 3 tries, but finally, the paintings lit up and were burned to a crisp, gasps of relief breaking out from the crowd. A question remains: who was the child in the painting? And why would an entire nation be relieved by setting his image on fire? The Crying Boy paintings were a series of portraits that featured a young child with tears streaming down his face. At a corner of each painting is a signed name: Giovanni Bragolin, but that's only a pseudonym. The real artist was called Bruno Amadio, a mysterious Spanish painter. He painted the crying boy in the 1,960 seconds, and they became instantly popular with tourists. Amadio would go on to make 65 paintings with variations of crying children in the years that followed. The paintings were reproduced and sold across Europe. At least 50,000 copies were purchased in the UK alone. Then, in 1985, the fires started. All across the UK, homes were being gutted by flames. No one made any connections between them until the British tabloid The Sun made a shocking claim. A firefighter reported that the ruins of all the recent fires had one thing in common: the crying boy painting. And unlike every other thing in the house, the pictures were never burnt. Their story spread like a virus, with a new one popping up every day. But the question in every story remained the same. What was this evil picture making homes catch fire? Before long, everyone who had the portrait hung up in their home was convinced that they were one errant cigarette away from burning their house down. The fire service tried to debunk the stories, insisting that the fires were caused by carelessness and that the pictures were likely covered with fire-retardant varnish. But the public was not convinced. Streets and dustbins were lined with the portraits as many tried to get rid of the cursed object. Eventually, The Sun urged its readers to send in the cursed pictures to rid themselves of the haunting. By Halloween, 2,500 copies had flooded their office, where they were all ceremonially burnt. But the story didn't die with the fire. Many people continue to speculate about those paintings. Some say the little boy is a Romani child whose family placed a curse on the artist. Others say the child died in the fire and his spirit is trapped in the painting. Now, you might think a cursed painting is unsettling. But wait until you hear the truth behind one of history's most notorious mystics. This next part changes the definition of madness. In the movie The Kingsman, Grigory Rasputin was a mystic Russian monk who kept the royal family under his thumb with a combination of opium and miracles. The character who danced while MI5 agents were trying to take him out might have sounded a little far-fetched, but truth is often stranger than fiction. Let's take a trip back to the early 1900s. The last emperor of Russia, Nicholas II, and his wife, Alexandra, have finally produced an heir for the throne. But there was a problem. Alexis suffered from hemophilia, a bleeding disorder. Doctors had predicted he would die before he reached adulthood, and with him, the monarchy. The empress turned to mysticism and began consulting unconventional spiritual advisors for answers, which was how she met Grigory Rasputin. During one of Alexis's bleeding episodes, Rasputin was able to help the boy. It was the first time anybody had been able to, and his visits to the palace became more frequent. Alexis turned a new leaf, and the empress was convinced that Rasputin was sent by God himself. But Rasputin was not ordained. He had left his home while his wife was pregnant with their 7th child and became a pilgrim. By the time he made it to St. Petersburg, he was known for his religious fervor and personal charisma, a scary combination. By healing the heir to the throne, Rasputin gathered more and more followers and admirers, but his controversial teachings earned him just as many critics. Rasputin claimed that yielding to temptations such as sex and alcohol was necessary for repentance. He was also accused of many offenses, ranging from unrestricted sexual affairs with sex workers and society ladies to raping a nun and drunkenness. However, the emperor turned a blind eye to these reports. When World War I rolled around, Rasputin had the royal family in the palm of his hand. He even convinced the emperor to lead the army to war, insisting that that was the only way to win. With the emperor out of the way, Rasputin's influence over Empress Alexandra increased. He became her confidant and personal advisor. There were even rumors that they were having an affair. Petitioners flocked to his apartment with bribes in return for getting choice political posts. Soon, government offices were filled with his own hand-picked candidates, and the Russian economy began to decline. The elite were not happy, and they were determined to get rid of the man. The end of the mad monk was just as dramatic as his life. The story goes that he was lured to one of the nobles' homes, where he was served cakes and red wine laced with enough cyanide to kill 7 men. But Rasputin ate it all, and was still standing. They then shot him in the back. But not only did the mad monk not go down, he chased his attackers. Finally, another gunshot would take Rasputin down. 3 days later, his body was recovered from the Neva River. But that isn't the end of the story. Some days later, his secretary released a letter where Rasputin predicted that if he was killed by a noble, the Russian aristocracy would fall. Only 2 short months later, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne in March of 1917. He and his family were later executed, bringing an end to the Russian monarchy. The Ouija board is a flat board used for getting messages from the spirit world. It contains every letter of the alphabet, the numbers 0 to 9, and the words yes and no. But this simple board turned out to have some very dark secrets. The Ouija board gained popularity in the 19th century, while spiritualism swept through the United States. There was no better time to plug into the supernatural. The Civil War had just come to a close, and families were searching for loved ones who hadn't returned from the war. When a harmless wooden board showed up in a toy shop in Pittsburgh, promising to connect them with the dead, it flew off the shelves. On Fridays, friends and families would gather for parlor games and summon dead relatives. Just about every home had one. The Ouija board became a cultural fixture until strange stories started coming in about the board making people do evil things. One of them was Leah Jimson. Jimson's husband had been murdered, so she and her friend, Nancy Bowen, turned to the Ouija board to find the killer. Slowly, the board spelled out the name Chloe and gave a home address. The 2 women trooped over to the home and found Chloe Morand, and then beat her to death with a hammer. But the lore of the Ouija board didn't stop there. 30 years passed before the Ouija board made the switch from a harmless family game to the tool of the devil. And it all started with a movie. In 1973, the movie The Exorcist hit cinemas. It was about a girl who was possessed after playing with a Ouija board. At that time, it was one of the scariest movies to ever hit cinemas. But what made it worse was that it was based on the very real demonic possession of 13-year-old Roland Doe. Just like in the movie, he had gotten possessed after playing with the Ouija board. Churches immediately tagged the Ouija board as a tool of the devil, and it went from a parlor game to a supernatural piece. But that hasn't stopped people from using it to check if anyone is listening from the other side. Founded by Karl Keller and Theodore Reuss in the 20th century, the Ordo Templi Orientis, OTO, was modeled after the Masonic order. Members of the order were taught mysticism rooted in ancient Greek and Egyptian traditions. As time passed, Reuss read Aleister Crowley's books, Remember Him, and was convinced that he would be an excellent addition to the order. When Crowley joined, he would rewrite a lot of their ritual material. The new OTO, under Crowley's belief system, took on a life of its own, as Crowley changed the guiding philosophy from Freemasonry to his occult system, Thelema. He also introduced secret techniques to the rituals involving masturbation and other illicit sexual activity like sodomy and bestiality. By the time Reuss resigned and Crowley took over, he was living primarily off membership dues and donations. Crowley also used the order to spread his magical philosophy. Many members rejected Crowley and his perspectives, and a separate group emerged that continued as OTO before Crowley's influence. The OTO still stands to this day, but it is shrouded in secrecy. In fact, unlike other organizations that thrive on a sense of community, OTO members are encouraged to keep to themselves and rarely come in contact with one another. We are still only scratching the surface. What you've heard so far are the history lessons. But the next levels are where the dark magic becomes personal, the house that burned down because of a curse, the ancient ritual that involves a naked woman as an altar, and a book detailing how to summon Lucifuge Rofocale, the demon in charge of Hell's treasury. Trust me, you don't want to miss the deep dive. The Boleskine House is a manor nestled off the infamous Loch Ness in the Scottish Highlands. It's a house shrouded in mystery and haunted by the supernatural. Yet, it didn't start that way. In fact, it was a church parish in the mid-17th century. Minister Thomas Houston had the unenviable job of laying animated corpses back in their graves after a devious local wizard had raised the dead in Boleskine graveyard. But the parish didn't last for long. The story goes that it was burnt to the ground with the congregation inside, killing them all. It was later rebuilt, and for years there was no news about the house. Then, it became home to a name that has followed us down this iceberg: author and occultist Aleister Crowley. Crowley bought the house to seclude himself for 6 months so he could perform an elaborate ritual to help him further his magic. The ritual was to summon the 12 kings and dukes of hell and bind them together. At one point, he claimed that he had been performing in a particularly sunny room when it suddenly turned completely dark, which prompted him to use an artificial light so that he could carry on. Love is the law, love under will. But before Crowley could finish the ritual, he said he was summoned to Paris and left. He never returned. Later on, Crowley confessed that the rituals he performed at the manor had gotten out of hand. Whether Crowley ran off to escape what he had summoned to Boleskine is anybody's guess, but when strange things started happening there, the locals knew who to blame. The house was sold to an army major, but the dark energy in the house got the better of him when he unlived himself in what had been Crowley's bedroom. The next owner of the house was the lead guitarist of Led Zeppelin, Jimmy Page. Page was a big fan of Crowley's and wanted to write songs there. However, he never really got to live there and left the house to a friend. His friend would report strange noises, ghostly apparitions, and a terrifying noise that sounded like a wild animal snorting and banging outside his bedroom door. In 2015, the Boleskine house made the news again. It had been burned in a mysterious fire. 4 years later, another fire was reported. All that is left of the Boleskine house and its stories is a shell of the building. The Black Mass, a dark parody of the Roman Catholic Church Mass, a rite performed by satanic cults to worship Satan, or both. There are 2 types of Satanists: LaVeyan Satanists and theological Satanists. The LaVeyan Satanist doesn't believe in Jesus or Satan, but they practice the Black Mass to harass and provoke Christians. It's a warped take on the Catholic Mass that often has a very sexual undertone. This might sound like a modern, edgy gimmick, but it dates back to the 4th century. The earliest practitioners of the Black Mass were a group of Christians called the Gnostics. They allegedly smeared their hands with menstrual blood and semen before taking the blood and body of Christ. Having a naked woman serve as an altar was also not out of the question. But outside of the parodies, Black Masses were also performed by theological Satanists. The first book on the Black Mass didn't come out until the 1962. Up until then, Black Masses didn't have a strict way that they were performed. Yet, they are still wrapped in secrecy to this very day. Necromancy is often known as death magic, a form of divination that involves speaking with the dead. But, unlike mediums, necromancers don't just chat up the dead for telling the future. Raising the dead to find out secrets, or even using a deceased body as a soldier or weapon, are just examples of things a necromancer could do with a corpse. Necromancy has existed throughout the entirety of history. It has been practiced across many ancient civilizations, from Egypt to Babylonia, Rome, and Greece. The Christian Bible even talks about necromancers, but always with a threat of death for anyone who goes down that route. One Bible story tells of how a king died because he consulted a necromancer. King Saul had asked a witch to raise the spirit of a dead prophet so he could find out the outcome of an upcoming battle. Things did not go quite how he planned, and the very next day, he died. While necromancers aren't getting killed anymore, the ritual is still seen as a type of taboo and kept very hush-hush. The draconian tradition is a sort of paganism practiced by people who believe in dragons to unleash their inner power. Dragons might be mythological, but they have appeared in many ancient civilizations across the world. Mesopotamian art and literature are chock full of images and folklore about ancient dragons that roamed the earth. The first ever recorded dragon was Kur, a Sumerian dragon. He looked like a gigantic snake and lived in the sea. Other civilizations had their versions of dragons. Some had feet, some had wings, and some looked like gigantic lizards. In a lot of these stories surrounding these dragons, they were either protecting or attacking villages. The traditions around worshipping dragons take a slightly different form from the stories. Dragons are worshipped for what they represent: darkness, chaos, and a violent force of nature. The rites follow the left-hand path and lead their followers to become one with their power. There are many ways draconian followers gain favor with dragons. Sticking to a carnivorous lifestyle, only eating meat that comes from animals that have been treated well, and not throwing away edible meat are just a few rules. The draconian tradition might not be popular, but the worship of dragons is. In China, dragons symbolize wisdom, power, good fortune, and wealth. Today, the Chinese dragon dance is one of the most important cultural performances used to celebrate. The Lesser Key of Solomon is a magical handbook on how to summon a demon and how to seek protection from them. It's like a yearbook for 72 demons in hell. It has their photos, their positions in hell, their different powers, and the rituals you could do to summon your very own demons. This grimoire was said to have been found in the 14th century in King Solomon's tomb. Like Jesus and Moses, King Solomon was a very important prophet in the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religions. Most popularly known for having 700 wives and 300 concubines, King Solomon was also known for his power over the occult, a power symbolized by a sign you just might be familiar with: the Star of David. Today, the six-pointed star is the universal symbol for Judaism, but it started as a brass magical seal ring on King Solomon's finger. The ring was given to him by God to control animals, the weather, and supernatural beings, including demons. As the years passed, the six-pointed star on the seal ring soon became a talisman used to ward off evil, and by the 17th century, it was the Star of David and represented the Jewish community. But this brass magical seal wasn't all that Solomon left behind. King Solomon had written out the knowledge behind summoning demons and kept it for his son. There might not be any evidence linking Solomon to the magic handbooks, but that didn't stop an entire magical tradition from springing up in his name. Two other magic handbooks linked to Solomon are the Magical Treatise of Solomon and the Major Key of Solomon. Demonology is the study of how different religions of the world see demons and their actions. The idea that there are evil spirits exists within many religions and myths. In Christian theology, demons were once angels who were kicked out of heaven because they refused to worship God and chose to follow Lucifer. They became evil and decided to thwart God at every turn by messing with humans, causing anything from illness to sin and even possessing them. Many priests studied demonology to figure out how to help people, but others went a lot deeper and tried to figure out how to summon demons and make them do what they wanted. Texts like the Lesser Key of Solomon or the Grimoire of Pope Honorius were written by people who were respected in the church. But Christians weren't the only ones who believed in demons. During the medieval and early modern periods, European folklore saw demons as wicked supernatural beings who would protect or assist witches while they practiced magic or divination. In Islamic culture, demons are spiteful, invisible creatures called jinn. They can change how they look, but most times they come in the form of cockroaches, snakes, scorpions, and even lizards. In Hinduism, demons are spirits that were once the souls of humans who did evil things. As punishment, they are condemned to roam without a physical form for a particular time as penance until they could be reborn as humans again. Blood magic is the use of blood to perform rituals and spells. This ancient magical art is considered the darkest and most powerful sorcery. Across many civilizations, it's believed that a person's soul is in the blood, which means blood has a lot of power. The use of blood in magic dates back to ancient civilizations when animals and humans were sacrificed willy-nilly for use in religious or magical rituals. The most detailed record of blood magic comes from the Aztec Empire of Mexico. They were renowned for having the most powerful magicians of all time. The Aztecs believed that the sun needed human nourishment to move around the world. 20,000 slaves and prisoners would be sacrificed yearly to make the sun move. Many of their artifacts show the grooves where blood once ran. But blood magic doesn't always involve human sacrifice. Back in the day, crime lords were known to use the blood of their enemies to make curses. This might be why women in certain cultures are almost fanatical about how they dispose of their menstrual pads. But practitioners of blood magic insist that dried or preserved blood has no power. While blood magic is often associated with causing harm, that's not always the case. Ancient alchemists were known to use blood to create healing elixirs. Medical mages used blood manipulation to heal the sick. And lovers even exchanged their blood to bind their souls together. How romantic. Le Dragon Rouge, also known as the Grand Grimoire, is a black magic handbook used for making diabolical pacts with devils. No one quite knows when this book was authored or how it came to be. The year it was said to be published is far earlier than when it first appeared in print. Yet, while it is difficult to pinpoint the year that it was produced, many scholars agree that a lot of it was copied from the Lesser Key of Solomon. Just like those two grimoires, it mentions higher and lower demons and ranks them with positions in the hierarchy of hell, starting with Lucifer, the emperor, Beelzebub, the prince, and Astaroth, the Grand Duke, as well as 6 lesser demons. The book also describes several demons, as well as the rituals to summon them to make a pact with them. It also details how to make pacts with demons and a whole lot of spells. Spells for winning the lottery, talking to spirits, being loved by a girl, making oneself invisible, etc. It recommends the magician have a bloodstone in their pocket while working the rituals. There are many stories of people trying to find fame and fortune using a spellbook. One of the more horrific ones took place in 2020. In June of 2020, 2 sisters, Biba Henry and Nicole Smallman, were in a public park dancing with fairy lights when they were stabbed to death by Danielle Hussein. Turned out the 9-year-old had made a pact with Lucifuge Rofocale. Lucifuge Rofocale is an infernal demon in charge of hell's government and treasury. He can make one rich quickly and can give worldly power and authority. Using Le Dragon Rouge, Dan drew up a handwritten contract signed with his blood. In return for winning a lottery jackpot, Danielle swore to murder 6 women every 6 months. After the murders, Danielle went all out, making bets and buying lottery tickets 352. He spent $162.88 in 10 days 353. He never won anything, and all he got for his trouble was life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 35 years. The Temple of the Black Light was a satanic cult that believed enlightenment could be achieved through chaos and destruction. It was originally called the Misanthropic Luciferian Order and was founded in Sweden in 1995 by Vlad Nemesis Kin. The cult practiced something called chaos Gnosticism. They believed in the Jewish and biblical creation story of Adam and Eve and the Abrahamic God that created the universe. But unlike followers of the Abrahamic faiths, they believed the universe should never have been created in the first place and planned to destroy it through magic and ritual. The cult started with just a handful of members, and they all had vampire pentagrams tattooed on their arms as a sign of their membership. 2 of the most active members were Vlad Nemesis Kin and John Nodvite. They often talked about performing human sacrifices. John was a Swedish musician best known as the founder, vocalist, and lead guitarist of the Swedish extreme black metal band Dissection. But in the summer of 1997, music was the last thing on John's mind. Instead, he was focused on making a human sacrifice. Days later, a gay man called Joseph Meder was killed in a park in Sweden. The police thought it was a hate crime, and the investigation stalled for months. Then, in December, Vlad's girlfriend walked into the police station with a story to tell, and the case was blown wide open. Vlad and John had tried to kill Joseph as a human sacrifice. During the investigation, satanic altars were found in their homes. They would summon demons and perform animal sacrifices using cats. They had planned to step things up by murdering Joseph, followed by mass suicide. Both men were found guilty and sent to the big house. They got out after serving just 7 years. John started up his band, Dissection, and after releasing 2 albums, they planned to go on tour before disbanding. But John was denied entry into the U.S. because of his criminal record, and the tour was canceled. In August of 2006, John's body was found in his home. The 1-year-old was surrounded by a ring of lit candles and a satanic grimoire in front of him, with a pool of blood underneath after he cut his veins. While the cause of death was pretty clear-cut, the reason behind it goes back to his belief. John believed that when a Satanist had accomplished everything he wanted, it was time to die with a smile. The Book of the Dead is a modern name for an ancient Egyptian scroll used during burials to help the spirit of the dead find its way to the afterlife. They contain magic spells that the spirit of a dead person would need while they make the long, challenging journey to the afterlife. The earliest of these texts date back to 1550 BCE. Scribes were usually commissioned to prepare books of the dead for burials. Even though it's called a book, it is a loose collection of sheets that were written by different people. They all have a different mixture of spells, and not one is the same as another. Some even had blank spaces to later fill in the name of the dead. During the funeral, priests would read the spells in the scrolls before leaving them in the tomb. Initially, books of the dead were reserved for the royal family, but later it was open to anyone who could afford it. But papyrus was expensive, and it was mostly found in tombs belonging to the social elite. Apart from the papyrus versions of the Book of the Dead, spells and passages from the text were also written on the walls of the tomb, mummy wrappings, and even inside King Tut's golden mask. One of the spells was to awaken miniature figurines that were sometimes buried with the dead. When they came to life, they could perform labor on behalf of the deceased. But the most important figure in the Book of the Dead was the god of funerary rites, Anubis. He was represented by a jackal, or the figure of a man with the head of a jackal. Anubis was also the protector of graves and lord of the underworld. As lord of the underworld, he had the important job of determining whether a soul would be allowed into the afterlife or not, based on whether their heart weighed more or less than a feather. Varg Vikernes, metal musician, neo-Nazi, arsonist, and murderer. At the age of 6, Varg just might have been the youngest neo-Nazi of all time. His family moved around a lot, and young Varg ended up as a student in an Iraqi elementary school. As the only white boy in the class, he quickly noticed that he was exempted from corporal punishment and was never beaten with the other students. From then, Varg started to call his teachers monkeys to their faces. As he got older, he followed neo-Nazi postulates and racist religious beliefs. At 19, Varg joined the black metal band Mayhem and became bandmates with Euronymous. Euronymous himself was notorious for pushing a band member to unalive himself. After that, he took some photos of the corpse, one of them becoming the cover of the live album Dawn of the Black Hearts in 1995. He also took pieces of his skull and gave them to other musicians to wear as necklaces. Varg became very jealous of the attention Euronymous was getting and started to set churches on fire. By the next year, he would have burned down 7 churches. Varg's reputation shot up in the Norwegian black metal scene, and all the attention was on him, or it would have been if Euronymous wasn't there. Varg even granted a newspaper interview and admitted to the church fires just to outdo him. But all Varg got was a 6-month stint in a pre-trial detention. Everything finally came to a head on the 9th of August 1993. Varg went to Euronymous' apartment and stabbed him 23 times before tossing his body into a lake. When the police caught up with Varg, he said he had killed Euronymous in self-defense, but he couldn't explain why he had 3 knives, a baseball bat, a bayonet, and an axe in his car. Varg was sentenced to 21 years in prison for murder, arson, and stealing explosives. When he got out of prison, he started a YouTube channel called Thulian Perspective and moved to France with his wife and kids, 418. But Varg did not stick to the straight and narrow 419. In 2013, he was sentenced to 6 months probation and had to pay a fine of $8,000 for inciting hatred and disseminating racist and anti-Semitic material on his blog 420. In 2019, Varg was forced to say goodbye to his 250,000 followers after YouTube deleted his channel for sharing harmful content 421. The Finders was a secretive commune based in Washington, D.C. It was started by former United States Air Force Master Sergeant Marion Petty in the 1970 seconds. But no one knew a thing about them until they made headlines in 1987. It all began in Tallahassee, Florida, after a woman called the cops on 2 men in suits playing in a park with 6 scruffy-looking children between the ages of 2 and 11. Their names were Douglas Emmerman and James Holwell, and the police found out all 8 had been living in a smelly van. When questioned about the children, Douglas said that they were taking them to a prestigious school in Mexico, while James fell face down on the ground and refused to stand up or answer any questions. The children were examined, and officers found signs of sexual abuse and malnutrition, as well as bite marks potentially belonging to an adult human. The 2 oldest children told police they were being weaned from their mothers and often slept outside. They described games that involved disrobing a man, wearing his clothes, and going through his pockets for money. The men were charged with misdemeanor child abuse and held on a $100,000 bond. Trying to find out what the men were hiding, police searched 2 properties owned by members of the Finders. They found photos of naked children dancing around slaughtered goats, instructions for getting female members pregnant, and instructions for buying, trading, and kidnapping children. For a week, the headlines alleged satanic ritual abuse. Then, the mothers showed up and claimed everything was on the up and up. They had asked the men to take their children on an adventure to Florida. This chaotic story was good enough for law enforcement. The men were released from custody, and all the charges against them were dropped. Federal agents had concluded that there was no evidence of criminal activity. The entire scandal was chalked up to miscommunication. Then, in 1993, an official report was leaked that the D.C. police's investigation into the cult had been dropped because the FBI asked them to. After almost 3 decades of silence, the FBI released hundreds of documents related to the Finders, but it only raised more questions. They were heavily redacted, and evidence collected during the searches was missing, including photographs, descriptions of the evidence, and the names of officers on the scene. Today, there are still many who think the FBI had something to hide, while the others are convinced that it was all a mistake. The 1980 seconds were a terrible year to be a Satanist in the U.S. The satanic panic was sweeping the nation, and when a particularly horrific murder happened in West Memphis, Arkansas, 3 teenagers would find themselves behind bars. On the evening of the 5th of May 1993, 3 8-year-old boys played together in the neighborhood. But when one of the boys' stepfathers, John Mark Byers, called them to come home, the boys never showed up and were never seen alive again. The police found their bodies in the woods near a drainage ditch. The boys were nude and hogtied. One of the boys, Christopher Byers, had suffered far worse injuries. He had several lacerations on his body and had been mutilated. There were many suspects: Christopher's father, who had a knife with blood on it that quickly went missing, and a middle-aged man covered in mud and blood that showed up in a restaurant. But once they had a look at the scene, they were sure it was the work of a satanic cult and ran with that theory. An officer immediately named 18-year-old Damien Eccles as the murderer. Damien was a misfit who studied Wicca and was in the habit of wearing black, reading horror novels, and listening to heavy metal. He denied having anything to do with the murder, so police turned up the heat on his friends. One of them was 17-year-old Jesse Miskelly Jr. Jesse had the mentality of a second grader, but the police didn't let that stop them. They interrogated him for 12 hours. Finally, Jesse said that he and Damien had committed the murders along with 16-year-old Jason Baldwin, and all 3 were arrested. The trial hinged on the murders being occultic in nature and the boys being Satanists. Turns out, that was enough to be found guilty. Damien was sentenced to death, Jason to life, and Jesse to life, plus 40 years. The case stayed closed until 2010, when new DNA evidence showed that there was no physical link between them and the crime scene evidence. Instead of going to trial, the three took a plea deal and were released for time served. As for the actual murderer, 3 decades later, the case remains wide open. One July day in 1995, the Poller family walked into the police station. They were living every parent's worst nightmare. Their 15-year-old daughter, Elise Marie Poller, a girl who had never put a foot wrong in all her life, had disappeared without a trace. For 8 long months, they followed leads across the country. But not one person could find a trace of where Elise had gone or what had happened to her. Then, the case was blown wide open when a priest called the police. He told them one of Elise's classmates, 17-year-old Royce Casey, had recently become a Christian and confessed to him that he and 2 other friends, 16-year-old Jacob Delmet and 15-year-old Joseph Fiorella, murdered Elise. The police didn't buy the story until Roy led them to her mummified remains. The reason for the murder was just as appalling. Royce, Jacob, and Joseph had recently formed the metal band Craziness, and they hoped to be the next big thing. To them, that meant making a satanic sacrifice, but not just anyone would do. It had to be someone whose murder would be the ultimate sin against God. They quickly zeroed in on Elise, a blonde, blue-eyed virgin. On the 22nd of July 1995, Royce, Jacob, and Joseph lured the unsuspecting Elise to a grove near her home. There, they strangled her with a belt, stabbed her more than a dozen times, stomped on her, buried her in a shallow grave, and left her to bleed to death. All 3 were sentenced to 25 and 26 to life in prison, all because of a satanic ritual. The Wickerman was a wooden structure that was used to sacrifice humans and animals by setting them on fire. It was a ritual performed by Celtic priests to celebrate the beginning of the harvest season. The first ever mention of the Wicker Man was in Julius Caesar's diaries in 55 BCE. The diaries describe a large, human-like figure made with wood and straw. It had limbs that were filled with living men and were set on fire. Criminals were usually used as sacrifices, but when there weren't any, the Celtic priests weren't against throwing an innocent person or 2 inside. The ashes left from the fire were then sprinkled on the soil. It was believed that this sacrifice would help crops grow. While this ritual has since died out, you still have a chance to see the Wickerman in action without the sacrifice. In northern Portugal, the traditional Carreto festival ends with the burning of a gigantic human statue with horns while young people run around it. The Burning Man in the United States and the Wicker Man Festival in Scotland are also popular festivals that use the effigy of the Wicker Man. The Ibadan House of Horror was once a local clinic for mentally deranged persons located in Oyo State in Nigeria. But for many years, locals in the area believed it was only that. On the 22nd of March 2014, a group of taxi drivers in Ibadan were searching for a fellow driver who had gone missing. After their search turned up nothing, the worried group knew right where to go: the Ibadan House of Horror, a dilapidated building that locals had heard screams coming from. Every time the police were called, they were told that the screams were from mentally ill people who were being treated. But this time, they were determined to leave no stone unturned. The men stepped into the building and made the most gruesome discovery. There were severed body parts, skeletons, and corpses all around the building. The floors and walls of the building were splattered in dried blood. 23 survivors were rescued from the building. Several of them were shackled in leg irons, and many of them were so malnourished that they looked like skeletons. The survivors told gruesome stories of how they had been kidnapped and forced to watch others getting slaughtered and sold in parts to their clients. These clients were described as high-profile members of society, but no one was ever arrested, and there are now several conspiracy theories that these men have the police in their pockets. It is well accepted among locals that affluent Nigerians are behind many of the kidnappings throughout the country. Today, there are still no clear answers about what exactly happened in that building, but the House of Horror is long gone and has now been replaced by a school. The Church of the Lamb of God, was a violent cult that was responsible for dozens of deaths because God told one man he could decide who would die. It began in 1924. Mormon fundamentalist and polygamist Aleister Crowley was excommunicated by his church for practicing polygamy. So, he scooped up his entire family, moved to Chihuahua, Mexico, and started a fundamentalist community. After Alma died, his son Joel took over and established the community as the Church of the Firstborn. Joel's brother, Ervil, was the second in command till the two had a falling out. Ervil wanted the church to practice blood atonement, an old Mormon doctrine where people paid for their sins with their lives. But Joel didn't agree. Because of that, Ervil began to preach that he, not Joel, was the true leader of the church. Then, he started up a rival church, the Church of the Lamb of God. Ervil preached blood atonement to his followers. He insisted he was God's representative on earth and could decide who should die for their sins. He also taught them that killing for him got them a spot in heaven. The first person to be killed by Ervil's followers was, unsurprisingly, his brother Joel. The next on the list was another brother called Verlan. Ervil thought Joel's murder would convince his followers to switch sides. Instead, they simply selected Verlan as their new leader. Ervil got his wives to find Verlan. 2 young men got killed, but Verlan got away. But that wasn't the only time. Ervil had one of his wives do his dirty work for him. In one instance, a follower's wife tried to leave, so Ervil's 10th wife drove her out into the desert and murdered her. Ervil wasn't only a threat to his followers. He sent letters to several polygamist leaders, making threats if they did not join his cult. One of them was Robert Simons. He would be killed on Ervil's orders in 1980. Ervil was finally convicted of planning one of the murders. While in prison, he wrote the Book of New Covenants and shared it with 20 followers. It had a list of 50 names marked for blood atonement. Ervil died in jail from an apparent suicide. 2 days later, his brother Verlan died in a car crash in Mexico. Coincidence? Who can say? Yet, even from the grave, Ervil's deadly legacy continued. When one of his wives tried to leave the cult, Ervil's son, Arturo, had her own son kill her. Then came the 4 murders. At exactly 4 p.m., on the 27th of June 1988, the cult killed 4 people on Ervil's blood atonement list in 3 different locations in Texas. This was the last straw, and several members of the LeBaron family and their followers ended up behind bars. 6 of the younger children were placed in separate foster homes in Utah. Then, on one single night, in September of 1989, all of the children disappeared from their foster homes. The Nazi Army's fascination with the occult was legendary. It was in their ideologies, their propaganda, and their symbols. Every part of the Nazi Army was deep, deep in the occult. Exactly how did a political party get so mired in the occult, and why? The Nazis were a German political party that came to power in 1933 under Adolf Hitler. But decades before they wiped out 11 million lives, many leaders in the army were part of the Thule Society. The Thule Society was a mysterious occult group dedicated to studying the mythological origins of the superior Aryan race. The Aryans had come from interstellar deities, apparently breeding with electricity and possessing paranormal abilities. They had the most pure blood of all the peoples on Earth. Their descendants had pale skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes. Meanwhile, the rest of the world was the result of humans and apes interbreeding. They were seen as impure and even evil. They thought that Jews, Romani, and black people were the most impure races, and it was important to keep the lines pure. Several prominent Nazis were either members or active within the society, including occultist Lanz von Liebenfels. Lanz agreed that interbreeding had robbed the Aryans of their magical power. Photos of Aryan knights defending blonde women from hideous-looking ape men appeared in magazines. These beliefs were shared among many who had become leaders in the Nazi Party. So, when they got into power, a lot of effort went into spreading propaganda based on these occultic beliefs. The Germans were told they were the pure race, and needed to protect their bloodline from non-Aryans. They took control of every part of the government, from school to music, even books. Slowly, the Nazi Party would manipulate and radicalize unfounded beliefs to drive hate. And many young people signed up to protect their pedigree. The Nazi army also secretly began creating their very own pure race of Aryans. Young girls who were blonde with blue eyes were encouraged to report at a center and create babies with other pure Nazi officers. The babies were taken away and raised by the SS. The Nazis also went as far as kidnapping children who had blonde hair and blue eyes in the countries they occupied. The kids were forced to reject their background and to accept the Nazi teachings. Yet, most of them still ended up in a gas chamber. From slicing one's hand to change fate to the horrifying reality of blood atonement cults, we've explored the secrets the world's most powerful figures and most disturbed minds have tried to hide. It's a journey not just into history, but into the darkness of human nature. If this video has changed the way you look at history, you should know that there is always more to the abyss. The real question is, are you ready to look deeper? Make sure you subscribe for more deep dives into the shadows, and let me know in the comments, what unsolved mystery should I tackle next?